All right, even though it's a minute early, there was a definite lull in the crowd voice there. So we're going to take advantage of that and ride the wave in. So thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for making the study of God's Word a priority. And we're so glad you're here. And Sue, if you'd open us with prayer, please. Amen. Yeah, you know, there's a book I have. It's called The Twilight Labyrinth, and the premise of the book is, why does evil dwell where it does? And he goes back through the history of man since the fall and just looks at what's been happening. And his premise is this, that as the centuries have added, that man has become less and less sensitive to the Spirit of God, less and less sensitive to the voice of God. And I'm not saying he's right, but when you see some of the things going on around us, you know, this law that was passed in New York where you can abort a baby right up until the 9th month, you know, you think, who would pass that? Who would allow that? And so anyway, but God is still on the throne. He's still in control. And he has a plan to get all this sorted out someday, right? And so we praise God for that. We're in the book of Psalms. What chapter? 63. That's right. And you could have said 65, and there's a reason you would have been close in that, closer than the answer sounds like. And we're at verse 4. We're going to pick back up at verse 4, and to make a point. He says, David says, I will honor you as long as I live, lifting my hands to you in prayer. And so we talked last week about what the proper posture is in prayer, and that, of course, it can be sitting, kneeling, flat out on the floor. It can be standing. It can be hands up in the air praying. And we said that, in fact, that was the way that they prayed. In part, we know, because back in Luke chapter 18, verse 9, the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, in verse 13, we read this last week, it says, but the tax collector stood at a distance and dared not even lift his hands to heaven as he prayed. So he stood in the distance, and he dared not even lift his eyes to heaven as he prayed. And so we know that at that time, at least in that story, both the Pharisee and the tax collector both stood to pray. And as we said, if you go to the Wailing Wall today, they stand to pray. And they don't have their hands in the air, but they do stand and pray, and they put their hats against the wall as they pray. And so the issue is there a right way to pray? Is there a wrong way to pray? What is our position in worship? There is no set position. And what we do as a church, however, is when we started Calvary, we decided that we weren't going to do anything at Calvary that was going to be at the expense of an unbeliever. Nothing that's going to get in the way of an unbeliever finding their way to Christ. Now, what that means is we, as a part of that, we said we will never compromise the message. The message is timeless. And if you try to change that, and some churches do, they try to soften that, they try to take hell out of their preaching because they think that offends. Actually, it works against you. That's just the truth. So you don't modify the message, you don't change the message, but methods must change. That's why we don't play organ music, because who listens to organ music? Not too many people. Not many young people listen to organ music, and that's why contemporary worship is a tool to use to reach the unchurched. But there are also certain things that we're aware of in the worship service that get in the way of unchurched people coming. So one is dress. So I wear jeans on a Sunday and a polo shirt or an open collared shirt. It's funny, I wore a coat and tie my whole life to work, and now I come to church and wear jeans and a t-shirt. It's just cute how God does that. But then we don't take an offering in the back because you hear people say, all they want is my money. I just had someone come up to me the other day again, and they said, you can't believe, Thom, how many people are so blown away by the fact that you don't take an offering, because it just decimates their argument that all the church wants is my money, And so we work at doing that. There's a reason we don't have 40 or 50 minutes of worship, and that is if you have 40 or 50 minutes of singing, a first or second time person visiting, you blow them right out of the water. They're not into that yet. That's just not going to work. And that's true with most Calvaries. Most Calvaries are 15 minutes of worship. But then we also, as leadership, we kind of limit our freedoms in some regards. If you go to 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 19. First Corinthians 9:19. First Corinthians 9:19. Paul says, "This means I'm not bound to obey people just because they pay me. I have become a servant of everyone so that I can bring them to Christ." A servant of everyone. So rather than leading, he's looking how he can serve people so he can win them to Christ. He says that when I'm with the Jews, I become one of them so I can bring them to Christ. When I'm with those who follow Jewish law, I do the same, even though I am not subject to the law, so that I can bring them to Christ. Now let's just pause there. You think how strongly Paul was opposed to the law, right? I mean, it was anathema to him. He fought tooth and nail to say that you're not bound by the law. That's ridiculous. That's the old system. But he says when he's with Jews, he would obey the law, even though he's not subject to it, so that he could win them to Christ. He says, when I'm with the Gentiles who do not have Jewish law, I fit in with them as much as I can. In this way, I gain their confidence and bring them to Christ. So this idea of when I'm with the Gentiles who do not have the Jewish law, I fit in with them as much as I can. Now, on a Sunday morning, we have people coming for the first time. Some people, and I'm amazed how many people will tell me, it's not every week, but at least once a month, maybe twice a month on average, I'll get somebody that says, I haven't been in church for 10 years. I haven't been in church for 20 years. There's a man coming now, he's been coming about 4 or 5 Sundays. He hasn't been in church for over 30 years. He was in a church and something happened and he was offended and never went back. I did a funeral, and he was at the funeral, and I invited him, and he came, and he kept coming. Now, my point is, Paul says, I fit with the Gentiles who are not believers, and no church background. That's a Gentile. They would have no Jewish background. He said, I fit in with them as much as I can. And so, what we want to do in our services, we want our services not to scare a person coming in for the very first time. And so there are some things that's going to scare a first-time person coming in. And so this is one of the reasons why we as leadership, as elders, we've decided that we're going to limit our freedom and we don't raise our hands in worship. Now, there's nothing wrong with raising your hands in worship. Don't get the wrong. And I don't want a church where nobody raises their hand in worship. I don't want that. I want people to feel free to do what they want to do in a worship service. I mean, play a trumpet, we're going to talk to you. You know, Jerry Paradise, who's one of the Calvary pastors in Philadelphia, said one time, they have a big church. How many people would it hold? 2,000, 3,000? In the service itself. Maybe 3,000? 3,000. So he said in the middle of the service, in the middle of the sanctuary, a guy stands up with a trumpet and starts blowing the trumpet during worship. And he said the ushers went and told him to leave. And he said, I'm not leaving. He said, I'm worshiping the Lord. He said, well, then you're going to worship the Lord in the parking lot. Play your trumpet in the parking lot to the Lord, because you're not going to worship the Lord here. But the idea is, you know, there's someone in our church on a Sunday morning. There might be a couple people in our church on a Sunday morning. And I take this very seriously. I really do. That some grandma, their grandma, or their mother has been praying for them for years to go to church. And now someone at work invited them, and they're there. There's a man that I worked with at Keller Brothers for 20 years. I left Keller Brothers 10 years ago. I prayed for this guy for a lot of the years that I was at the dealership, that he'd come to know Christ. There's a woman coming to our church, an older woman, who went down to the dealership to have her car serviced, and she invited him to come to church. And he came. He hasn't been in church. She told him it was 20 years since he's been in church. He was in church now for a couple Sundays. And I take that very seriously. There are people that are coming for the first time, and they are scared. They're like a cat walking through a dog pound, you know, that has cages, but they're afraid one of those gates is open and they're going to get torn to pieces, because that's how they come in. You know, you may not believe this. I met with a guy last week. I meet with him on a regular basis. I mentioned once before, he had been a Satanist living in Philadelphia, Kensington, strung out on drugs his whole life, horrible background. When he started coming, he told me this. When he said, and I wrote it down, I said, I want to interview you some Sunday and hear you say this. He said, I thought when I'd come into a church that I'd have to give a certain amount of money to come in. Just to get in, I'd have to give a certain amount. You know, we have no idea how skittish people are about coming in and what they think they're going to encounter. Now, I've said this before. I'm not opposed to people raising their hands in worship. But, when I was at the dealership, if there's a guy I've been working on or praying for and witnessing to for 10 years, and this is the Sunday that he's coming to church with me, and he's going to sit in the back row, you know that. I'm not going to get him in the middle. I'm not going to get him three quarters. I'm just happy to have him in. And he's going to want to sit in the back row because he's scared. And if when I'm in the back row, we stand up for worship, and the first song they sing, and everybody in the back row jumps up and throws their hands in the air, he's going to feel really uncomfortable. Now, to us, we're used to that culture. He is not. Now, you can say they see that at concerts all the time. I'm telling you, it's different. It spooks them because that's not that's not the world that they're in. And so we as leadership have decided we're not going to model that because, see, here's what happens. When people come in, and this is how it works, people come into the church and they see, let's say they see half of the people raising their hands in worship. They're not going to feel comfortable. They're not going to do that. And it's kind of fake if they do it because that's not really what's going on in their hearts. You with me? So they don't do that, and they see that the pastors are not doing it. They know it's not the litmus test for spirituality in this church. I mean, if everyone does, but I don't, it's okay that they don't. But if I do, then they don't know. Is it the standard? Is this the mark of spirituality? Am I the oddball because I'm not? Or even with people that come on a somewhat regular basis and they're not comfortable doing that. but they see that I do, and all the ministers do. Now it gets a little complicated. Do you know what I mean? Is this the standard? Should I be doing that? And I don't want there to be any external action on the part of people in the fellowship that people think they need to match some external behavior in order to fit in or to hit the mark of being spiritual. Because then it can get ugly with that. Do you know what I mean? Because then it's the mark, and there are those that do, and there are those that don't. So, and I want to explain this. And so people will say to me, when you talk about this, people will break out in two categories on this because they come to me. And this is what they'll say. They'll say, look, you can't tell me how to worship. And I said, I'm not telling you how to worship. I'm not. You worship how you want. You want to raise your hands, you raise your hands. I'm just telling you, and then I don't because I'm limiting my freedom for the sake of an unbeliever. I'm limiting my freedom. Could I? Of course I could. But I'm limiting it so that it doesn't get in the way of someone coming to Christ, because I don't want to spook them. We can't forget. See, if your feeling is only me and what I experience, I get that. But if your heart is really turned to a person who's there for the first time, then we limit our freedoms for the sake of someone who's just starting to figure this all out. Does that make sense? So again, I would never tell someone how to worship. But what I am saying is, for me, and I'm not suggesting you do the same thing. It matters more because I'm in leadership. It matters a lot more. Because I'm telling you, I'll give you an example. I went to Times Square Church. Sue and I went a couple of times, and that was David Wilkerson, right? And man, it was a charismatic church. But I remember specifically that when Dave worshiped, he didn't put his hands up. Now, why did that matter to me? Because what it said was, it's not the litmus test for spirituality in this church. Even though people do, it's not the standard, or he'd do it. Does that make sense? And in that, people had freedom to or not to. So it's not a big deal, but it pertains to other things as well, where we limit our freedoms for the sake. And that's what he says. He says, when I'm with the Gentiles who do not have Jewish law, I fit in with them as much as I can. A Gentile's an unbeliever. When an unbeliever comes in the church, we try to fit in with them as much as we can. Dress, language, not using big theological words. Try to fit in as much as we can so we can win them to Christ. So, and I have some scripture for this, but the fact that Paul took this to the extent that he did is proven by the fact that he had Timothy circumcised, because he knew that if Timothy wasn't circumcised, he would not be able to minister effectively to the Jews. They would have rejected him had he not been circumcised. And yet in Galatians, when we studied it, you remember Paul said, I wish those who require you to be circumcised would go castrate themselves. Yeah, that would hurt. He said, I wish that those who require you to be circumcised would go castrate themselves, and yet he had Timothy circumcised. But the reason was this, that he was so serious about this, that he knew he had to become all things to all people to win them to Christ. And for Timothy, becoming all things to win them to Christ meant he had to be circumcised. Does that make sense? We limit our freedoms. Timothy had the freedom not to be circumcised. But he limited his freedom in order to bring the Jews to Christ. That's the extent that Paul went to get at this. So, let's go on. Psalm 63, verse 5. That's Paul and Timothy. Timothy doesn't look shocked yet, so I don't think he quite got to that part. There we go. This is 63, verse 5. He says, you will satisfy, this is again a Psalm of David when he's in the wilderness, right? The intro says, a Psalm of David while he was in the wilderness of Judah. Verse 5 says, you satisfy me more than the richest of foods. I will praise you with songs of joy. The image here is of a banquet. And David has before him, I will honor you you satisfy me more than the richest food at the most elaborate banquet. And so keep in mind, David's in the wilderness, and he's remembering, my guess, and longing for a home-cooked meal. Because you don't get home-cooked meals in the wilderness of Judah. It's desert. But what does he not do about this? What does he not include in his longing? What does he not include that's good that he doesn't include? He doesn't complain, right? He longs for food, but he doesn't complain about it. And that's a reminder of in Numbers where the people complain about not having enough food. In fact, let's look at that. Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Numbers 11, verse 4. Numbers 11, verse 4. It says, then the foreign rabble, I like that, the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt. And the people of Israel also began to complain. Oh, for some meat, they exclaimed. We remember all the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt. And we had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic that we wanted. And all the Lebanon bologna we could eat. But now our appetites are gone, and day after day we have nothing to eat but this manna bread, manicotti, banana bread, manna. All we have is this manna. And so, the point is, David is in the wilderness remembering a banquet, maybe even eating off a locust like John the Baptist did. But he doesn't complain. And here, they're in the wilderness complaining. And so the question is, are you a complainer? Are you a complainer, or are you content? Are you content, or are you contentious? Are you quick to complain, or are you grateful for what you have? In the marriage series, they said one of the most critical pieces in keeping a marriage strong is that you show appreciation to one another. And the last vestige of a marriage that's fallen apart is when it's contempt. Just contempt for one another. And contempt is evidenced by harsh, cruel words, unkind words, uncomplimentary, unappreciative words. Contempt. And so a way to divorce-proof your marriage is try to show gratitude. Thank you for making the meal. Thank you for bringing money home that we can put food on the table. Thank you. Show gratitude. It's huge. Years ago, I remember someone saying this: if you could take all of your problems, now really I want you to think about this. If you could take all of your problems, the things that really bother you about your life and where you are, if you could put them all in a 55-gallon drum, and everyone else in the world put theirs in a 55-gallon drum, and you stirred it up, would you be willing to take the risk that you'd go into that drum and pull out the same number of problems that someone else has instead of you, and have their stuff instead of your stuff? Would you? In the world? In the world? Think who's in that bucket. When you think about it in those terms, all of a sudden you don't feel so bad about what you've got, because what you're really saying is, I wouldn't, if I had the chance, on just the odds that I'd get a better deal, I wouldn't be willing to take the deal. And that means you've got a better deal, and you do, than half the people in the world, more than half, or you take the deal. So that has helped keep my head on straight sometimes, folks. Because when I think, all this is going wrong and all that's bad, okay, Tom, put it in a bucket and pull out someone else's. Do you want that? No. Then shouldn't you be happy with where you are? Isn't that the answer? There's a little poem called "The World Is Mine." Today upon a bus I saw a girl with golden hair. She seemed so happy I envied her and wished I were half so fair. I watched her as she rose to leave and saw her hobble down the aisle. She had one leg and had a crutch, but as she passed, she gave a smile. Oh God, forgive me when I whine. I have 2 legs. The world is mine. Later, walking down the street, I met a boy with eyes so blue. But he stood and watched the others play. It seemed he knew not what to do. I paused and said, "Why don't you join the others, dear?" But he looked straight ahead without a word, and then I knew he could not hear. Oh God, forgive me when I whine. I have 2 ears. The world is mine. 2 legs to take me where I go. 2 ears to hear all I should know. Oh God, forgive me when I whine. I'm blessed indeed. The world is mine. Fitting? Something to keep in mind. Let's go on to verse 6 and 7. We are a lot like God when we're grateful. And just think how it sounds to God when we complain. Just think of that. He's looking at children starving in Nigeria. He's looking at Christians in concentration camps in Korea. And we're complaining that someone took our parking spot, or someone's sitting in my pew in the church, or I didn't get the raise that I should have gotten, or I can't afford that model and I have to settle for this model of a car. And he hears that. Think how that hits his ears. Whoa. So 63 verse 6 and 7. It says, I lay awake thinking of you, meditating on you through the night. I think how much you've helped me. I sing for joy in the shadow of your protecting wings. I lay awake thinking of you at night. It's so important that we remember God's faithfulness to us in the past. When we have doubts, when we have questions, when we wonder where God is or why things aren't happening faster, or if this is ever going to turn out for good, or we get worried, really worried, the thing we need to do is remember how faithful God's been in the past. And I end up saying this so many times when people are worried about something. I'll say, look, how old are you? And they'll say, I'm 45. I'll say, you're 45. All these years, God has been faithful to you. Every day, because here you are. You're fed, you're alive, you have shelter. So there were some rough days, but here you are. Is it really reasonable to think God's going to all of a sudden blow it tomorrow when he's been faithful all these days? And so it's good. There you go. That's the whining. Did you ever look like that? Yeah. And this is the Jordan. Look at Joshua. This is that story in Joshua. Joshua chapter 4, verse 19. This is when Joshua and the Israelites, Moses died on the east side of the Jordan. Joshua's now the leader. He brings the people across the Jordan, and they're going to conquer Jericho as their first stop on their campaign to take the promised land. And this is that trip across the Jordan River. It says in Joshua 4, verse 19, the people crossed the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, the month that marked their exodus from Egypt. They camped at Gilgal, east of Jericho. It was there, listen, at Gilgal that Joshua piled up the 12 stones taken from the Jordan River. Then Joshua said to the Israelites, in the future your children will ask, what do these stones mean? Then you tell them, this is where the Israelites crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the riverbed right before your eyes, and he kept it dry until you were across it. And he did it as he did at the Red Sea when they dried up until we had all crossed there. He did this so that the nations of the earth might know the power of the Lord, and they might fear the Lord your God forever. But it says that he piled up 12 stones from the Jordan River as a monument. As a monument. And the idea, folks, is that in all of our lives, we have touchstones in our past, times that we know God has delivered us. Can you think of some of those? Some times in your life where you just know God was there in a big way, where he delivered you. You know? Listen to this. I met with a man today. Listen to this. This is so cool. He was an alcoholic, lost his wife and children through it, was at the depths of despair, had no church background, was at the end of his rope. This was years ago. This was 10 years ago. And he said, I fell down on my face and I wept and I cried out to God and said, God, I need help. God, I need help. And he said, and that noise fits into what's going to happen next. He said, a number came into my mind. And it was enough numbers to be a phone number, and I dialed it, and it was a counseling center. And the woman on the other end said, this is what you need. You need to go to a detox. And she went down through a list of things that she said, and he said that as she's saying this, in my mind I was hearing clearly the words, listen to her, that's what you need to do. Listen to her, that's what you need to do. Now, do you think that's a touchstone in his life? You think that's the time he goes back and says, when he starts thinking, maybe there isn't a God? You know, maybe God isn't faithful. Maybe he won't come through. Maybe what these people are saying is true, that I'm just imagining God. He can go back to that moment and say, no. I remember a time. No one can tell me that was not God that did that for me. And see, you have those times in your life, and they're more important than you know. Those are the things you need to go back to and recount and remind yourself of the time that God delivered you. You know, for me, it was my wife. You know, when I was in college, I went to school that had a ratio of 7 guys to 1 girl. And that was all right for the girls. It wasn't so hot for us. And I dated a little bit, but man, there was nobody there that, you know, it was a party school. And I thought, you know, there's no one in this world for me. I'm just not going to find anybody. And I went into a depression. I did. And I remember in my dorm one weekend, I was sitting on the counter, and I said, God, and some of you've heard this story. I said, God, I'm done with this. I'm done dealing with this. I said, look, this is all in your hands. If you want me to be married, that's fine. You don't want me to be married, that's fine. That's all right. If you send me a girl with one eye in the middle of her head, that's okay. If that's what you want me to have, that's what I'll have. It doesn't matter. I'm just taking myself out of the equation. I said, it's like there's this picture on the wall, and it's been this picture frame with no one in it, and I've been kind of at the edge of the frame trying to drag some girl into this picture. I said, I'm walking out of the picture. When you want to bring a girl into the frame and have me walk in there, I'll walk in, but I'm not going to make this thing happen. I'm done. And that's the first thing in my life I ever surrendered to the Lord. First thing I ever surrendered to the Lord. And it was, I don't know, a couple months later, God brought Sue into my life. And that has been a touchstone in my life. Because I've gone back to that so often and said, God, if I could trust you to find her, you know, and you've proven yourself through all of those years, year after year, that she's exactly the person you want to be married. That's such a big thing. How can I not trust you for other things? Do you know what I mean? That Sue is one of my touchstones that I go back to. And I remember God's faithfulness, a time when I surrendered. And so, you know, I just encourage you to have those touchstones in your own life. Remember those. when doubts come, when questions come, that's what you need to go back to. You can't go back to other people's stories. You may read great autobiographies and hear their stories. It won't get you there. You have to go back to your stories. And remember times where God acted and moved on your behalf, and there's no question. And he'll do it again. So let's go into verse 8, Psalm 63:8. It says, I follow close behind you. Your strong right hand holds me secure. You know, sometimes we walk alongside Jesus. Sometimes we follow close behind. So it's okay to walk alongside and follow behind. Is it ever okay to walk in front of him? Probably not a particularly good idea, unless you're got your one eye back on him as you're walking, you know, to make sure that you're where you should be. You know, I just one little point here, and you know the song "Footprints in the Sand," and then I realized you were carrying me, and I just want to give you another thought on that. That is a beautiful song, but the truth is, really, the truth is, if you're a Christian, God doesn't really walk ahead of you, leading you with a rope. He doesn't come behind you with a cattle prod pushing you. And he doesn't really even walk alongside of you, leading, holding your hand. Not really. He's inside of you. That's better yet. Right? I mean, it's one thing for him to be alongside of me, but man, if he gave me the option, you can be alongside of me or in me, I'll take the in me anytime. Because I know I'm a problem. And so my flesh needs to die, and Jesus is the one who replaces that flesh if I invite him and allow him to live his resurrected life in me and through me. So I mean, I like the imagery, and I you know, this, I love this picture. You know, I walk with him. He walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me he is his friend. I love that imagery. It's beautiful, and it's true. But don't forget he's in you, right? It's much more than just being alongside of us. And then it says his right hand holds us securely. King James says, my soul followeth hard after thee. And so in Hebrew, that idea is to cling. When it says my right hand, his right hand holds me securely. The Hebrew is to cling to cleave, to stay with, to join together, to pursue closely, to adhere to firmly, listen to this, as if with glue. As if with glue. That his right hand holds you securely as if there's glue that's connecting, crazy glue, gorilla glue, connecting your hand to his. And I hate to bore you, but again, there's so many of you that are new, and some of you haven't heard this, and this may help you, because it helped me. When I was suicidal in my 30s, and I wanted to end my life, and again, God, it was just a miraculous work that God did overnight. But the problems that were causing a lot of this in the business didn't go away overnight. I woke up the next day, and the problems were still there. This was during the recession of 1980. Interest rates were 21%. Not a good time to be in the car business. It was bad. And problems didn't go away overnight. So when, I felt great about my walk with the Lord, but when I got off my knees to go to work, the problems were there. And I remember praying in the morning, and this is how I ended every morning. I did, because I needed it. I pictured God being 100 feet tall, and I had my arm around his ankle. And this is what I said. I said, God, as long as I'm holding on to you, no one's going to take me down today. Who can take me down if I'm hanging on to him? Right? I mean, I'm in a building that's 40 feet tall. He's 100 feet tall. Who's going to take him down? Some Ford rep, some bank rep? No one's going to take him down. And if I'm hanging on to him, no one's going to take me down. Now, if I let go of him, all bets are off. But man, I knew I couldn't let go of him. And I'm telling you, that got me through all those months, hanging onto that ankle. Because you know that's true. You know if you're hanging onto him, you are not going down. How is that possible? It's not. possible. So this whole thing is his right hand holds you securely. To me, it's his ankle. Holds me securely. So you may get in some jams some days, folks. That imagery may help you, because I'm telling you, it's what I had to hang on to, and I did. And he was faithful. Then under verse 9 and 10, 63, 9 and 10 says, "But those plotting to destroy me will come to ruin. They will go down to the depths of the earth. They will die by the sword and become the food of jackals." It says, "Those that seek to take my life, they shall go to the lower parts of the earth, the grave and hell, and food for jackals." Just this thing on food for jackals, Benson, the commentator, says this, quote, "The dead," I think some of you say foxes. Benson says, "The dead bodies of these wicked men shall lie unburied upon the earth, and shall become prey and food to wild and ravenous beasts, and especially to foxes, which abounded in these parts." And did you know there were a lot of foxes in Israel? Did you know that? Look at Judges 15. Judges 15. And this is right around the time of Ruth, by the way, in that era, the book of Ruth. Judges 15, verse 3. This is the time of Samson. When Samson's having his trouble, many troubles. Let's read verse 1, I guess, for some context. Judges 15:1. It says, "Later on during the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat as a present to his wife. He intended to sleep with her, but her father wouldn't let him in. I really thought you hated her, so I gave her in marriage to your best man. But look, her sister's more beautiful than she is. Marry her instead." Samson got really mad. You don't want to get Samson mad. Samson said, "This time I cannot be blamed for everything I'm going to do to you Philistines." Then he went out and caught 300 foxes. He tied their tails together in pairs and fastened a torch to each pair of tails. Then he lit the torches on fire and let the foxes run through the fields of the Philistines. He burned all the grain to the ground, including the grain still in piles and all that had been bundled. He also destroyed their grapevines and olive trees. That's a pretty brilliant strategy, isn't it, to get rid of wheat fields? You know? Tie two foxes together with a flame in between them and let them loose. But the point is, he found 300 foxes. I don't think you'd have a hard time finding 300 foxes in Lebanon County. Maybe they're here, but I mean, one person's finding them. So the point is, there were a lot of foxes. So, we're going to now shift to Psalm 66. To save you a lot of explanation, we already did 64 and 65. We went back and caught these other ones. Now we want to go to 66. And so let's read the whole Psalm 66. Again, this is for the choir director, a song, probably not written by David. In fact, we'll see could not have been written by David. Shout joyful praises to God, all the earth. Sing about the glory of his name. Tell the world how glorious he is. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds. Your enemies cringe before your mighty power. Everything on earth will worship you. They will sing your praises, shouting your name in glorious song. Come and see what our God has done, what awesome miracles he does for his people. He made a dry path through the Red Sea, and his people went across on foot. Come, let us rejoice in who he is. For by his great power he rules forever. He watches every movement of the nations. Let no rebel rise in defiance. Let the whole earth bless our God, and sing aloud his praises. Our lives are in his hands, and he keeps our feet from stumbling. You have tested us, O God. You have purified us like silver melted in a crucible. You've captured us in your net and laid the burden of slavery on our backs. You sent troops to ride across our broken bodies. This is why this could not have been David. We went through fire and flood. You brought us to a place of great abundance. Now I come to your temple with burnt offerings. Another reason it couldn't have been David, there was no temple yet with David. to fulfill the vows I made to you. Yes, the sacred vows you heard me make when I was in deep trouble. That is why I'm sacrificing burnt offerings to you, the best of my rams as a pleasing aroma, and I will sacrifice bulls and goats. Come and listen, all you who fear God, and I will tell you what he did for me. For I cried out to him for help, praising him as I spoke. If I had not confessed my sin, boy, this is going to be a good one when we get to it. If I had not confessed my sin in my heart, my Lord would not have listened. But he did listen. He paid attention to my prayer. Praise God who did not ignore my prayer and did not withdraw his unfailing love from me. Now as we sing this, oh, there are the foxes running through the fields. As we sing this psalm, read this psalm, you can tell quickly it is a psalm of thanks. There's a lot of, and these were to be sung. So this was a song of singing, a song of praise. And I read this, looked up this on singing. Look at verses 1 to 4. It says, shout joyful praises to God, all the earth. Sing about the glory of his name. So singing. I looked this up. Listen to the benefits of singing. Singing strengthens the immune system. The University of Frankfurt discovered that proteins in the immune system that function as antibodies were significantly higher after people sang. Proteins in the immune system were higher. Singing improves your posture. Singing helps with sleep by stopping snoring, and helps with sleep apnea by strengthening the throat and palate muscles. Interesting. It's a natural antidepressant because it releases endorphins. In addition, scientists have identified a tiny organ in the ear called the sacculus, which responds to the frequencies created by singing. The response creates an immediate sense of pleasure regardless of what the singing sounds like. Aren't you glad? Regardless. That means guys in the shower, even there. Even your voice. Nope. Even what it sounds like. You know, I've just shared this. There was, when Sue and I went to Midway, there were two older women. They were very plain. And they still wore the bonnet and the long cape dress. And when they sang, they were sisters. I'm thinking one was never married, the other was a widow. Is that right? They both? I think that's... Neither was married. Listen, when I get something wrong and my wife says something right, she's always right. And that's not me. That's just, I've been married long enough to know that is how it works. So they were both never married. But they were probably 75 years old. And when we would sing in the morning, they were tone deaf. And I don't mean they were sharp and flat. It was and loud. And they sang loud. Should I do that again? They sang loud. And I remember, because we sat off to the left, and I could kind of look across and see them. Man, nothing was going to deter them. They were full board ahead. And I remember thinking, won't it be great when they get to heaven and get a perfect voice? Because I can just picture them in heaven. And then a couple of months later, maybe a year or so later, I remember thinking, it hit me one Sunday, no. They'll sing just like that. But I'll have ears like Jesus. I'll hear them like Jesus hears them now. That's the transition that needs to happen. Not their voice, my ears. So I'm not sure their singing released endorphins in my ears at that time. But so here are some other benefits. Singing lowers stress levels. We should know that. Singing releases stored muscle tension and decreases the levels of a stress hormone called cortisol in your bloodstream. Singing improves mental alertness. Improved blood circulation and oxygenated bloodstream allows more oxygen to reach the brain. This improves mental alertness, concentration, and memory. The Alzheimer's Society has even established a Singing for the Brain service to help people with dementia and Alzheimer's maintain their memories. Singing can widen your circle of friends. Depends how you sing. Let's go on to the next one. Singing broadens communication skills. According to an article in The Guardian, singing to babies helps prepare their brains for language. Music is just as important as teaching reading and writing to a young age to prevent language problems later in life. If you enjoy writing your own lyrics, honing this talent can improve your ability to communicate in different ways. And I remember years ago, I read an article, and it dealt with how music can help you study. Classical music in particular. They said it has to do with the rhythm of the beat, and that it helps you, as it's a systematized message to your brain, it helps you line up the packets of information that you're memorizing as you hear the music, that they work together. You will memorize things better if you have classical music on, something that has a good rhythm to it in order to memorize. So there's a lot of benefits to music. And again, verse 5 and 6, look at 66, 5 and 6. Come and see what our God has done, what awesome miracles he does for his people. He made a dry path through the Red Sea, and his people went across on foot. Come, let us rejoice in who he is. Again, this is hundreds of years after that, but it's a touchstone, right? It's a touchstone that the psalmist points his audience to go back and remember when they went through the Red Sea. And then Psalm 66, 7, and this is interesting. It says, for his great power he rules forever. He watches every movement of the nations. Let no rebel rise in defiance. Look at some other verses relating to how God observes the corruptness of the nations. There's sing praises. He remembers the wonders. And then this is the corrupt men of corrupt nations. Again, it says, look at Psalm 22, verse 8. We're going to look at a couple of these that deal with the corrupt governments of the nation. And how does that connect to believers in those nations? 22, verse 8. Well, this is a little different in this translation. That says, is this... No, that's not right. And that's wrong. Skip that. 103:19. Psalm 103:19. I'm sorry. Psalm 103:19. It says he watches over the movement of the nations. Psalm 103:19 says, the Lord has made the heavens his throne. From there he rules over everything. So the nations may rule, but he rules over them. Acts 17, verse 26. Acts 17, 26. This is Paul in Athens. He says, Acts 17:26, from one man, he, God, created all the nations throughout the whole earth. He decided beforehand which should rise and fall, and he determined their boundaries. Psalm 125, verse 3. Psalm 125, verse 3. And this is a big one. Psalm 125, verse 3. This is incredibly profound. Psalm 125, verse 3 says, the wicked will not rule the godly, for then the godly might be forced to do wrong. Now, if it's true, as it says back in Psalm 103, that God is in the heavens and rules over all the nations of the earth, and if it's true, as it says in Romans 13, that there is no authority anywhere except this ordained by God, then how do you explain when there's a wicked government? Because it says back in Psalm 125, verse 3, the wicked will not rule the godly, for then the godly might be forced to do wrong. So when we talk about authority, and we say there is no authority anywhere except that it's ordained by God, people will come back and say, well, how do you explain Hitler? How do you explain Hitler? He was in authority. Are you saying that he was ordained by God? Well, let's just look at that in general terms. It is very interesting, and I encourage you to do this sometime. Read through 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which is the story of the kings and the nation of Israel and Judah as through that period of time. And you will find, if you look closely, that God always coordinates a leader that he judges simultaneous to the nation. So if God's going to judge a nation for their sins, he calls a leader into that position of power and judges him at the same time he judges the nation. Now, so let's go to Hitler. Hitler was a reflection of the German people at that time. He was. You know, Hitler was elected in a democracy by vote. He was the popular candidate. And if you read the newspaper articles that were written well before Hitler ever came to power, the German newspapers blasted the Jews. They did. They said that they would build the economy up, crash it, build it up, crash it, build it up, crash it, and they have become wealthy at the expense of the Germans. And so, in many ways, Hitler was a reflection of the heart of the German people. Now, would they have killed the Jews openly like he did? Many probably not. But the antagonism for the Jews was prevalent among the Germans. So, I'm not asking you to buy this. What I do ask you to do is read those accounts of the kings and see how God does that. It is very interesting. And you'll find this all over the place. I have my Bible marked up places where this is just so obviously true. What does God do? I mean, what if there's a nation that's 99% wicked and 1% Christians? He still judges it, you know. But he delivers those people in some way out of that. I believe that he does. You know, when you talk about this in the Bible, about God, for instance, the idea is there are people that are pre-tribulation, post-tribulation, and mid-trib tribulation. In other words, so the last 7 years on the earth before God judges it, there's going to be a time of horrible tribulation. I mean, it's going to be horrible. The Antichrist comes to power. There are 21 cataclysmic devastations that strike the earth. You know, it's going to be horrible. And the idea is that people that are pre-tribulation, we believe, and that's what Calvary Chapels are, is we believe we're not going to go through that. We're going to be taken before that ever happens. When that begins, bang, the rapture takes place and we're out of here. But people that are mid-trib think that at 3.5 years, they go. Post-trib means that they think you go through the whole 7 years and then God takes the Christians. But the idea is on pre-trib is that God has not appointed us to wrath. That's what it says in 2 Thessalonians. God has not appointed us to wrath. The idea being that we're not going to go through that. But the examples that they will point to when they say that is back to Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah. God delivered Lot out of Sodom and Gomorrah. He said, get out. Remember the conversation Abraham had with the angels? What if there are 50, 40, 30, 20, 10? For the sake of 10, I won't destroy the city. He delivers them out. Noah was the only righteous man on the face of the earth. He delivered him out of the flood. You will find throughout the Bible that even if there's just 1 or 2 or 5, God will deliver them out. And so I believe this psalm is true. And I don't know how God's going to do it, but I believe that when God judges a nation, he's going to deliver them out. You know, it's interesting. And Jesus talked about Jerusalem. When you see the city surrounded, flee. Do you remember it says that? He said, when you see the city, flee. Do you know, when we studied in Matthew, when the Romans came and encircled Jerusalem, and they held it under siege for, I forget, 2 years. And they crucified Jews that tried to escape. They hung them on crosses outside the city. When the Romans took Jerusalem in 70 A.D., it was a bloodbath. In fact, it said that Josephus said that when the Romans lit the city of Jerusalem in fire, a lot of the house fires were quenched by the blood of the Jews who were killed in the streets. That's how much blood flowed in the streets. But when I studied that, they said there's not a record. There are records that all of the Christians got out of that city because of the prophecy. When they saw the city surrounded by the Romans, they left early. They got out. God delivered them there through prophecy. And so I think in these settings, my guess is that God will get us out. There's a way that he'll get us out because he has not appointed us unto wrath. Some other versions on that verse, NIV says, the scepter of the wicked will not remain over the land allotted to the righteous, for then the righteous might use their hands to do evil. ESV says, for the scepter of the wickedness shall not rest on the allotted land to the righteous, lest the righteous stretch out their hands to do wrong. And contemporary Christian version says, he won't let the wicked rule his people or lead them to do wrong. So one last thought on that. What this really says, folks, it's 8 o'clock. What this really says is, if it's true that there is no authority except God appoints it, and if it's true that God, and this is especially true, if it's really true that God coordinates the judgment of a leader with the nation, then it really is significant who the leader is. You with me? Because if you see a leader and it has all the markings of someone that God's going to judge, Hitler, Pol Pot, Baby Doc DeValier, all these despots in the past who were wicked, and God did judge that nation with them, they all fell. But just look at who the leader's going to be. Because if you want just a sneaking idea of where a nation is on that timeline, look at the leader that God has allowed to come to power. Because he will coordinate the judgment of the nation with the leader. It's just what he does. Let's close. Father, thanks for this time in your word, and I pray, Father, you'd be the after teacher. I pray, Lord, that by your Holy Spirit, you'd be the one that leads us and teaches us and takes us into truth. And help us to apply what we've learned tonight in ways, Lord, that help us to be more Christ-like, and that we would be wary of serpents and harmless as doves. And this we pray in Christ's name. And all of God's people said, amen. Hey, thanks for coming tonight. If you can stay for prayer, if you'd like to, the ladies will meet over there. The men over here, God bless you all. Thanks for coming.